Greetings. My name is Ken Bailey. I'm a long-time hobby cartoonist. I'm in my 50s. When I was a kid, I grew up in a place called Rangeley, Colorado. Rangeley is the site of one of the nation's historic and long-producing oil fields. And I became very interested in the operation of said field while I was there. As a kid, I enjoyed photography and I took many photographs, which made me all the more interested in things, and over the years, have done more and more studying on what I could find about the Rangeley field in particular, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. Well, we'll draw some quick sketches here. Oil was first discovered in Rangeley seeping from the ground by the Native Americans, and the first attempt to drill for it was done about 1900, give or take a few years. They used what was called a cable tool method. Now, many of you who are a little familiar with the oil industry are used to tall oil derricks, tall steel towers, towering over the countryside. Well, believe it or not, the very first oil derricks were in the Rangeley area were nothing more than poles like this one. And they used what was called the cable tool drilling method. What it basically was, it was like punching into the earth. Picture a hammer and a nail. It's just kind of like that, in that you had this tall pole, and they would put they had a sharp drill bit, and they had something called a walking beam, which would go up and down, and largely it would pull the drill bit on the end of a string of pipe and let it drop into the ground and punch a little deeper, and then they would pull it back up and let it drop into the ground, and they'd keep doing this. As they got the pipe all the way into the ground, they would screw another length on, and they kept doing this until they punched down deeper and deeper and got to the oil. They were pulling meager amounts of oil for a number of years out of what they called the Manco Shale. That was a rather shallow area, it's just several hundred feet down. However, some geologists had long suspected that there was much more oil further down, and starting in 1933, they drilled a deep test, a company called the California Company, using a tall steel oil derrick, and brought in the Raven A number 1, which was the first deep well in the Rangeley field to be successful. This went down almost a mile deep. Remember, the Manco's wells had just been several hundred feet deep. I don't think they went more than 1,000 feet deep, where this new deep test with a much larger oil derrick, the derrick is the name for the tower, went down almost a mile deep, 5,280 feet deep. And before you know it, they found there was an enormous oil pool down there in sandstone called Weber sand soaked with oil. And the Raven was the first of almost 500 deep oil wells that were drilled. Here's our derrick. Now, there are many of you that still kind of associate oil fields with tall towers kind of like this. And this was the way it was for many years, and it got into movies, and that's why we think about it. But Rangeley went through a number of stages since then. The very first well was actually shut down. There wasn't much of a demand for oil, but when World War II came, there was a tremendous boom that lasted from the mid-1940s until about 1950. And by the time they were done, they had drilled almost 500 oil wells. Now, I hadn't come on the scene just yet, but I'm told that the very first deep wells in Rangeley were free-flowing. In other words, they didn't need anything to pump the oil to the surface. They just had on the top of an oil well a series of, now these are not the same size of course, but they had a series of pipes and valves over the hole that oilmen would call a Christmas tree, because it looks a little bit like a Christmas tree if you really use your imagination. Let's draw a friendly oilman here. Good old Fred the oilman. Fred's a good guy. He's happy because this Christmas tree indicates that he's got a well here that is flowing by itself, doesn't need to be pumped. Fred saves all kinds of money not having to buy pumping units. Now, eventually, well, let's give Fred a place to put the oil. We'll give him some storage tanks back here. There we go. Eventually, the pressure in the field, which is caused by natural gas pushing the oil up through the hole to the surface would drop off and they had to put in pumping units. So we then entered the next phase, and this is what I would call the late boom years, the early 1950s. The boom was still on. They were still drilling like nuts, and they would have tall towers called derricks that would drill the oil wells. We'll put our derrick here. There was a little kind of like a crow's nest on the top where people, the oil men, could stand. They had like a little A-frame on the top, and they had a big, what they called a traveling block that would pull the pipes out of the ground. Once they got the hole drilled all the way, of course, they would, if the well ever broke down, they would need a place to stack the pipes as they pulled them out of the ground until they found a broken one. So they would take down the tall tower they drilled the well with, and they'd put in a smaller tower called a pumping derrick. Under this tower, they would put a pumping machine or pumping unit. They're called by many names, but most often they're called by two of the main pieces. We'll draw a bigger one in just a minute, called the walking beam or the horsehead. They were called horsehead pumps or walking beam pumps. These were powered by either electric or internal combustion motors, and they would put a little tin shack on the back. Now, the Rangeley field, here we see a well in the distance, was drilled on what they call 40-acre spacing. In other words, from one oil well, they would very carefully space them out in rows, so the next one would be 40 acres away. So there we have our next tower or derrick, the next pumping unit underneath, and the next little shack behind the motor. Let's put a little background in here. The western end of the field, there was a very tall hill called Mellon Hill, like this, and there were even some derricks right up the side of Mellon Hill, like this, in the distance, with their little pumping units and little shack, like that. Okay, put some clouds in. I wasn't here to see this either. Unfortunately, I would have really liked to be. This was the most picturesque thing. If you could stand on Mellon Hill, and there actually are a few old photographs in their museum that still shows this, you could see these towers just stretching out towards Rangeley as far as the eye could see. Mellon Hill was on the one end of a 10-mile bowl or valley, and Rangeley, the town, was on the other end. Now, underneath the derrick, they had what I told you was called a walking beam pump for the main component. Basically, the oil well is a deep hole in the ground, and there are rods that are hollow that can be filled with oil, but the oil has to be sucked to the surface. The way they did that was with a walking beam, and what this was, just like it sounded, a steel beam that pivoted in the middle, kind of like a seesaw. And they put this on some legs, and then here's our oil well, there's our Christmas tree, and there's the rod that needs to be pulled up and down out of the ground. On each upstroke, it brings the oil just a little bit more to the surface. So they have what they call a carrier bar, and attached to this, they have some steel cables, and attached to the front of the cables, they have what is called the horse's head. They even had a little eye in it. I suppose that was to put a hook in to lift it off if it needed work. Now remember, you've got more than a mile of rod that has to be pulled up and down. So you need some counterbalance on the other end of the seesaw. And so they would have what they called an equalizer, and then they'd have two arms coming down to a crank that was on a gearbox that went around and around. As the crank went down, it would pull the walking beam down, the horse head would go up, and it would pull the rod up. As the crank came up, it would go down in the front and reverse the process. But how did you get enough weight back here to counteract all the weight of this rod? Well, they had huge iron slabs on the end of these cranks called, wait for it, counterweights. And so there are counterweights, and these would go around and around, counterbalancing the tremendous weight of the rod and making this beam go up and down like a seesaw. When it went up and down, it was said to look like it was walking, and thus the name walking beam. Now, in the early days, every one of these had to have one of these towers over the top. In case it broke and they had to pull the rods out, they were in about 40-foot lengths, and they would unscrew them and stack them inside this tower. Well, in the late 1950s, they invented a way to fold up a tower on a truck. So thus, there was no need to have a separate tower over every well. You could just have one tower that folded on a truck and drive it to whatever wells needed to be worked on. So the towers were held to the ground by 4 big cement plugs, and eventually they took all the towers away, and all that was left was the 4 plugs that had once held the tower over the pump. The pumps remained, so you would see rows of these pumps every 40 acres apart in nice neat rows like little tin soldiers, but the towers came down very quickly except in the town of Rangeley itself. Now this is about the time I came along, and so fortunately I got there in time to take a picture of the last few towers that they had left over pumping wells in the town for tourists. Well, too bad tourists, even those came down in the late 1960s, and by the mid-1970s even the towers over the inactive wells had disappeared. Okay, but by now the boom was over. They had one company take over the whole field rather than everybody trying to do their own thing, and then that one company would just pay out all the other owners, and they were able to do what is called water flood injection. This is a secondary recovery, and I'll just explain a little bit what that is. The Rangeley oil field is what's called an anticline. Picture this is the surface, okay? Here we have Mellon Hill over on the west, and good old 10 miles. And here on the east is the town of Rangeley. In fact, there I am with my camera. Hi! Okay, anyway, now we have mountains surrounding this basin on both sides. But if you just imagine that you could cut the earth in half and look at a cross-section, and I've exaggerated a little bit, a long time ago there was a great push up, and this push caused the mountains to split and pull apart, and the middle to raise up, and this is why there is this 10-mile valley. If you were up here, it looked like a low valley for 10 miles, but a geologist would look at that and say, what's pushing that up? There must be something way down below. And basically there was, and that is about a mile down, there is hard rock that had pushed up. And it's called cap rock. It's very hard rock, and there was hard rock underneath, but it split apart, and you got this kind of little basement or cellar like an upside down bowl. Anticline is what this formation is called. Anti means upside down. I don't know what cline means, but it's like an upside down bowl. This all filled in with a softer porous rock called Weber sandstone. Now there were other formations up here where there were breaks in the hard rock known as the Manco Shale. These were what the little shallow wells drilled into before they discovered the deep stuff. But when they finally drilled the Raven well, there's the derrick, Eureka! There comes the oil, because there was this huge area about 10 miles long by 5 miles wide filled with this saturated oil. Now there are different kinds of places where the rock splits apart and the oil is trapped. Oil men call these, wait for it, traps. Traps are where oil can be trapped underground. Traps usually have three things underground. At the top is the place you're most likely to find natural gas. This is under pressure, and this is what pushes the oil to the surface. In the middle, you got the sandstone just saturated with good old oil. Some of us wonder if this is maybe dinosaur stuff over many years squished into fossil fuel. That's why they call it fossil. But underneath we got water. And these three things are found in three different layers, like 3 layers in a box of Neapolitan ice cream. Now when the field is young, the natural gas forces the oil to the surface. It goes up through the oil wells by itself. And of course, pretty soon they're drilling more oil wells down every 40 acres into this huge underground pit. Eventually, though, the gas it's used up enough that there's not enough to push the oil to the surface, and that's when they start putting those pumping things in to suck the oil up these holes. But eventually, even that's not enough. You get too many pumpers, and some of the oil just doesn't want to come up anymore. So then they come up with this bright idea. Oil floats on water, right? So you take some of the oil wells, and instead of having them suck oil up, you convert them so they're now pushing water down. These are called water injection wells because they are now injecting water, a new substance, back into the underground pit. As the water builds up, it pushes the remaining oil into the oil wells that are still sucking up. And that is how an anticline oil field works when it is put on secondary recovery. It's called secondary because the primary recovery is when there's enough oil and gas that it goes up by itself, or the pumps can get at it easily. When it needs help, that it's in a secondary stage. Okay, so A number of the Rangeley oil wells were converted to these water injections. They took the pumping units away. But for the remaining ones, they're now bringing up oil and water. That's an awful lot of fluid. So they came up with a new super pump, bigger than the old pumps. I'm going to start with the horse's head because that was the biggest and most impressive part of these new super big pumps. The company that made this particular model called them air balances, and I'll explain that in just a minute. These were my favorites in the Rangeley field. They were enormous. They probably were not all that much far from 50 feet when they reached the top of their upstroke, when they got to where the horse head was as high as it could go. They had kind of a frame like this, and the seesaw part was at the end instead of in the middle. They had this huge horse head, and they could pull that rod almost 200 feet out of the ground. We'll put our little oil well down there. They sat on a cement base, and they had arms that were on a rotating crank, just like their smaller conventional pumps had that we showed you a minute ago, except that there were no counterweights. Counterweights to counter the weight of the rod now bearing all that extra fluid would be so huge they would be impractical. At least that's what they said back in those days. So it pivoted on the end, and you had these arms, but the arms just weren't strong enough to push the thing up and down. So they had a big air cylinder right behind the horse's head. This is a little like the air cylinder on your screen door. And it works a little bit the same way in that as the pump comes down and the cylinder comes down, it squeezes air into the cylinder until that air wants to push back. And when it gets to the right pressure, it pushes back and pushes the pump back up again. These pumps were so huge that if any of the old towers over the other pumps were left, they had to take them down when these came because they wouldn't fit underneath them. In fact, often, let's draw a little background here. Often when these came, you'd see a time where, here's our oil well, they'd even leave the old pump with just its horse's head taken off, and it would be replaced by the new, bigger pump on the same site, kind of like that. They started at one end of the field and started putting these big monsters in and replacing the little ones, and they gradually worked their way east. This started from the end of the boom days in about 1950 up until the 1970s, when the next big thing happened. That brings us into the modern era. And that is, now remember, I was still largely a kid in those days. And so I tended to see things as kids might, talking about their favorite sports team and the other team. Or, for some of us, comic books. You had heroes and villains. And here we have, this is the villain of the oil field. Arg! If you ask me. Remember, I was a kid with a camera who loved photographing those great big machines going up and down. And so here we have their nemesis. Arg! This is a control box for a submersible oil pump. Now, this is not an oil pump itself. It's just the control box. And it had a light on the top. Early ones just had one light. Later ones had two lights, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But what they were was they were a little like a super sump pump, like the sump pump in your basement. Your basement fills up with water, this thing goes down into the ground, you turn it on, and an electric motor sucks away all the water. Well, this is kind of that in reverse, in that it's an electric pump that goes right down the oil well's well hole. You don't need a pump on the surface. You don't need a walking beam. All you need is, like I said, the pump is at the bottom of the well. It's an electric motor that turns and pushes the oil up, and all that you see up on the surface is one of these boxes where the controls are. This thing that I made like an evil eye is actually some sort of seismograph-like thing that there's a little thing, it almost looks like an old-fashioned record player that tracks how much oil is being pumped. And the light, I suppose, is to indicate at night whether the pump is running or whether it's turned off. Driving through Rangeley at night, as these things became more and more common, was very pretty, because every 40 acres there'd be these little twinkling lights all over. But during the day, frankly, I hated them, because all that would be left of the old walking beam pumps I used to love is the cement base where they used to stand. They'd take the pump away, and pretty soon all you had was this dumb little box. Now they started these also at the western end of the field, and gradually these moved east, and within 10 years they had the whole field converted over to these. Now once again, remember, I was a kid with a camera. So me saying they're dumb and they're stupid and they're no fun and they were bad and I wish they'd never come is a little kid talking, because the truth is these things can move tremendous amounts of fluid. They probably saved the life of the ranged oil field. So if you're adults trying to run an oil field like adults would, these made perfect sense. If you're a kid with a camera, these things stink. Anyway, so this takes us from the 1970s to the present. If you go to the Rangeley field today, you won't see much more than you might catch a glimpse of some of these as you're driving through the field. But I miss, like so many of us romantics who don't actually have to pay for the oil field's operations, I miss the old days. I miss these big monsters, these big 192 air balance pumps. I miss the days when they were drilling all over the place and learning about the anticline. I miss the earlier conventional pumps. I really miss the old oil derrick towers. And boy, if a certain white-haired gentleman with a certain conveyance that can take you back in time shows up, I would like to go back to the very early days when they were drilling the Raven well and see some of that history for myself. Okay, you have now just passed lesson 201 in Rangeley Oilfield Stuff History. You may now go get yourself a snack and go back to the main menu and go back to watching the really interesting videos. But thank you for sharing this time with me. This is the former oil geek kid Ken Bailey signing off and saying have a nice day, and the next time you turn on your automobile, remember somebody had to get that stuff out of the ground for you. Goodbye.